Alrighty, how's everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. And this channel is for educational purposes. And you have uh, come upon uh, a resource that's going to enable you to be exposed to some things that you probably don't know about. Things that would probably really enhance your opportunities for improving your mental, spiritual, and physical health, except that they have been suppressed and that the powers that be don't want you to know about these various things. And so that is the purpose of this channel, is to expose and explicate these um, hidden truths, hidden theories, hidden discoveries and concepts. And this is number 412 of our Bible Decode series. We've focused primarily on the New Testament so far. We will certainly be getting into the Old Testament. I've touched on it in a number of videos, but a systematic deconstruction of the Old Testament will be forthcoming. But for now, we continue with the New Testament, and we have examined a lot of aspects of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. The New Testament, just like everything else in your environment, is a psychological operation. It is 100% completely fiction. Now, it may be based on some things that actually did happen, but the events depicted in the New Testament are fictional. The Romans created the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Jews had been a big thorn in the side of the Romans for over a century, since the Romans occupied Judea in 63 BC. Uprisings, revolts, revolutions, terrorist attacks, insurrections, culminating in a full-blown war that lasted for 7 years, from 66 to 73 AD. And the two primary generals for that war, who were both wounded for the Romans, were General Vespasian and his son General Titus. They eventually become the new emperors, the new dynasty of emperors called the Flavian dynasty, starting in 69 AD. And they had a vested interest in mellowing out the Jews, making sure that this war time situation doesn't happen again. Trying to domesticate, tame, prune, um, mollify the Jews, get them to get with the program. Uh, the Romans were very tolerant of diverse religions. They wanted you to practice your religion, but they just wanted you to give a nod to Caesar, and that is what the Jews weren't willing to do. Um, Emperor Caligula, back in the early 40s, I believe, late 30s, early 40s, he tried to install a statue of himself into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and that almost led to a war. Because the Jews believe in "thou shalt not," worship graven images, and so that didn't go over very well. Um, and as a matter of fact, the Romans um, basically let the Jews be exempt from having to have the statue of Caligula in their temple, unlike all the other people. So the Jews literally carved themselves out an exemption for fighting back so hard against the Romans. And that is kind of the core attitude that the Flavians were trying to um, tame with their psychological operation that they called the Gospels. Now, the way they did it is they wrote the story of Jesus, and they backdated the story by 40 plus years, set him back into the 20s and 30s AD. And at the same time, they wrote a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews that they called um, the Jewish War, 7 volumes. And it was written under the name of Josephus. We don't really know exactly who Josephus was. Historians mostly think that he was really a person who really existed. But if you read his autobiography, he says so many things that stretch credulity that I can hardly believe that historians take him at his word. But they do so out of desperation, I believe, because there are so many situations in ancient history where Josephus is like the only word. He's the only person that's documented any of this stuff. So historians rely on him so hard that I think they are in denial of the fact that he is not reliable because he's a psychological aberration, even if he actually did exist. But his backstory is so unlikely. He, according to his autobiography, he was a Jewish um, military commander, and he surrendered to Vespasian of the Romans during this war in about 68 AD. And at that time, he had an epiphany, and that caused him to defect to the Romans. He gave Vespasian the star prophecy, saying that one day I foresee that you will become the new emperor. And when Vespasian actually did become the new emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace, appointed him as one of the court historians, and adopted him as a member of his family. So he is now known as Flavius Josephus of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Now, that goes 100% completely against both Jewish and Roman customs. The Jewish custom is you never give the star prophecy to a non Jew. The star prophecy is only for Jews. And for Romans, the practice is when you defeat your enemy, you drag them through the streets of Rome as part of the triumphal procession after the war is over. It's you don't pardon them and adopt them as members of your family. You drag them through the streets, humiliating them before then you execute them. That's how the Romans do it. So this is going very far off of protocol, the story of Josephus. But anyway, if you read Josephus, you will discover that the parallels between the work of Josephus and the New Testament are overwhelming and really very obvious, that they are both intended to be read together as part of a kind of a satire or a comedic ridicule, mockery of the Jews, along with an attempt to try to convince them of this Jewish Messiah who was not a military commander as the prophecies foretold, but instead was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek. So, in other words, a um, Jewish Messiah who is completely deferential to the Romans, but one who is very critical of the Jews. And every time that Jesus gets frisky, he gets frisky against the Jews, not against the Romans. So when he overturns the tables of the Jewish money changers at the temple, or when he yells and screams at the Jewish merchants who are selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple, or when he uh, warns his potential Jewish Messiah disciples that they have to abandon their families to follow him. These are strikes against the Jewish traditions and rituals, which is exactly how the Romans would have written it up. And then writing it up further into the epistles, leaving the Gospels and into the Pauline material in the New Testament, Paul is even more deferential and even more um, deferential to the Romans and even more critical of the Jews. And Paul goes flat out to justify slavery, Roman slavery, throughout the epistles. So um, what we have is basically a Jewish Messiah and a Jewish um, evangelist who are tailor-made to the Roman, um, the Roman cause, the Roman agenda. That should be fingerprints enough. It should be red flags enough. But then, and the mere fact that the Gospels are written originally in Greek should be another red flag. But then the real coup de grace is reading Josephus and comparing it kind of line by line with the work in the Gospels, especially the book of Luke. Just go over the military campaign of Titus and the ministry of Jesus, and you will see that they are identical, except that the events that occur in the Gospels are more symbolic, whereas the events that occur in War of the Jews are literal. But every place that Jesus go, or really every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order. They encounter parallel events, and each event is 40 years apart from the other. So, and we're talking about over 40 separate events. And so you can calculate the odds on that. Um, I would check into both Joseph Atwill's work, Caesar's Messiah, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and also Michael Menescott's work, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. But for the purposes of today, the main point is that the Romans borrowed so many different elements to put into their Gospels as a psychological operation because it was a limited hangout. It's something that they had to put in religious elements just to make it look good. You have to put in 80% of, something good to be able to, have the 20% poison to be believable. And so the Romans, and that's why I think that Josephus was kind of like a think tank. The Romans used many different intellectuals, many different intellectual traditions to put together their gospels. The Romans used ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, religion, and mythology, ancient Egyptian lore, as well as ancient Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Persian mythology and religion, Norse, maybe Mexican, maybe Pygmy, Sumerian, as well as pagan mystery schools, alchemy, um, numerology, astrology, shamanism. All of it is embedded into the New Testament. And we're looking at the work from this author, Kersey Graves, his 1876 book called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity, where he documents some of the antecedent sources that the Romans used. Now, he doesn't know anything about the Roman origins hypothesis. He really just documents the sources that were used with the Gospels and with the New Testament, not really commenting on, who put those sources there. But this is chapter 32. We're in the middle of it right now, and he's talking about the 346 points of parallelism between Christ and Krishna, the ancient Indian Messiah slash Savior, who is dated from about 1200 BC. So over 1,000 years before Jesus, there was this story of Jesus, but it was called Krishna, and it has over 300 points of parallel between uh, or similar to the story of Jesus that we went over in the videos over the past week or so. Now we're getting toward the end of the chapter, and he's um, talking about just various points to elaborate here. Okay, so this is number 31 here. Pregnant with meaning in the text, it was in the city of Antioch, Syria. The disciples were first called Christians. That's noted in Acts 11:36. Here is conclusive proof that the disciples of the Christian faith were not always known by the same name and were not at first called Christians. Then what were they called during the earlier years of their history? Here is a great and important query, and one involving a momentous problem. Couple the two facts together and that the disciples were first known as Christians at Antioch, and that the Essenian order of believers expired and went out of history about that period, and the question is at once and forever satisfactorily settled. As I've noted in previous videos, I totally disagree with this point. I believe that the Essenes were also a psychological operation, and that they never existed either. Because the only mention of the Essenes, of people who actually saw them in action and witnessed them firsthand, were Philo Judaeus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger. These are all Roman agents of the Roman royal families. Okay, so this is part of the same psychological operation that the Romans used to create Christianity, more or less. So the Essenes didn't exist either. Now, the Essenes seem to be this pious, very ascetic, nonviolent sect of Jews that a lot of scholars believe that Jesus grew up as a member of the Essenes. But there is no evidence, there's no credible evidence that the Essenes actually existed. Only the fanciful accounts of Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. And their accounts are again, anecdotal, and, almost offhanded, within their historical narratives, within talking about other things. They just bring these guys up, just kind of to mention them, to put them into the historical record, to historicize them. But there is no other evidence of them existing, as far as I know. You can tell me if I'm mistaken about that. Okay, it was not an infrequent act on making important changes in a religion and adopting some new items of faith to change the title of the system and give it a new name. After Alexander Campbell had made some modifications in his previous religious faith and started a new church, his followers were popularly called Campbellites. Elias Hicks ingrafted some reform ideas into the Quaker faith and instituted a new society of that order. Hence and henceforth, his disciples were known as Hicksites. In like manner, Jesus Christ, having made some innovations in his inherited Jewish faith, which was of the Essene stamp, by engrafting more of the Buddhist doctrine into it. And when he says Buddhist, he really means Hindu/Buddhist, but more Hindu if he's referring to Krishna. But anyway, by engrafting more of the Buddhist doctrine into it, his followers were henceforth called Christians. How complete the analogy! Here, let it be borne in mind as powerfully confirmatory of this conclusion that the first Christians were, as history affirms, merely Reform Jews. The 12 chosen were all Jews, probably of the Essene order. Total speculation. According to the Reverend Mr. Prideaux, the Jews of this order were first called Israelites, in common with the other tribes, then Hasidim, and thirdly, Essenes. And finally, after the Essenian Jesus Christ, with some new radical ideas, proclaimed, "Ye have heard it, hath been said by them of old time, thus and so. But I say unto you differently." The title was again changed, and they adopted or received the name of Christians. The Essenes going out of history at the very date Christians first appear in history. But put this and that together, and the chain is welded. Again, not necessarily, not logically. Thus, we can as easily trace the origin of Christianity as we can trace the origin of a root running beneath the soil in the direction of a certain tree. History, then, proclaims that to the honest, pious, deeply devout, self-denying, yet ignorant, slothful, and filthy Buddhistic Essenes must be awarded the honor or dishonor of giving birth to that system of religion now known as Christianity. Okay, now this new section is called Krishna as a God, Additional Facts. The following additional facts relative to the history, character, life, and teachings of Zeus Krishna, or Zeus Krishna, or Jesus Krishna, are drawn mostly from the Vedas, Bhagavad Gita, which says the Bible in India. 1. His virgin mother, her character. The Holy Book declares that, quote, "Through her the designs of God were accomplished. She was pure and chaste. No animal food ever touched her lips. Honey and milk were her sustenance. Her time was spent in solitude, lost in the contemplation of God, who showered upon her innumerable blessings. She looked upon death as the birth to a new and better life. When she traveled, a column of fire in the heavens went before her to guide her. One evening, as she was praying, she heard celestial music and fell into a profound ecstasy, and being overshadowed by the Spirit of God, she conceived the God Krishna. Number 2, Krishna, his life and mission. This sin-atoning God was about 16 when he commenced active life. Like Christ, he chose 12 disciples to aid him in propagating his doctrines. He spent his time working miracles, resuscitating the dead, healing lepers, restoring the deaf and blind, defending the weak against the strong, and the oppressed against the oppressor, and in proclaiming his divine mission to redeem man from original sin and banish evil and restore the reign of good. It is declared that he came to teach peace, charity, love to man, self-respect, the practice of good for its own sake, and faith in the inexhaustible goodness of the Creator. Also to preach the immortality of the soul and the doctrine of future rewards and punishments, and to vanquish the prince of darkness, Rakshas. It is further declared that Brahma sent his son upon the earth to die for the salvation of man. His lofty precepts and the purity of his life spread his fame throughout all India, and finally won for him more than 3 millions of followers. He inculcated the sublimest doctrines and the purest morals and the grand principles of charity and self-denial. He forbade revenge and commanded to return good for evil, and consoled the feeble and the unhappy. He lived poor and loved the poor. He lived chaste and enjoined chastity. Problems that problems the most lofty, and morals the most pure and sublime, and the future destiny of man were themes which engaged his most profound attention. Krishna, we will venture to say, was the greatest of philosophers, not only of India, but of the entire world. He was the grandest moral figure of ancient times. Krishna was a moralist and a philosopher. We should admire his moral lessons, so sublime and so pure. He was recognized as the divine word. He received the title of Jesus, which means pure essence. Krishna signifies the promise of God, the promised of God, the Messiah. When he preached, he often spoke from a mount. He also spoke in parables. Parables play a large part in the familiar instructions of this Hindu Redeemer. He relates a very interesting parable of a fisherman who was much persecuted by his neighbors, but who, in the time of a severe famine, when the people were suffering and dying for the want of food, being so noble as to return good for evil, he carried food to these same persecuting enemies, and thus saved them from starvation. Therefore, said he, do good to all, both the evil and the good, even your enemies. His addresses to the people were simple, but to his disciples they were elevated and philosophical. Such was the wisdom of his sermons and his parables, that the people crowded around him, eager to behold and to hear him, saying, this is indeed the Redeemer promised to our fathers. Great multitudes followed him, exclaiming, this is he who resuscitates the dead and heals the lame and the deaf and the blind. On one occasion, as he entered Madura, the same way Christ entered Jerusalem, the people came out in flocks to meet him and strewed branches in his way. On another occasion, 2 women approached him, anointed him with oil, and worshipped him. When the people murmured at this waste, he replied, better is a little given with a humble heart than much given with ostentation. Such was his sense of decorum, that he admonished some girls he once observed playing in a state of nudity on the bank of a river after bathing. They repented, asked his forgiveness, and reformed. The followers of Krishna practiced all the virtues and observed a complete abnegation of self, and lived poor, hoping for a reward in the future life. They occupied all their time in the service of their divine master. Pure and majestic was their worship. Krishna had a favorite disciple, Arjuna. who sustained to him the relation of John to Christ, while Angada acted the part of Judas by following him to the Ganges and betraying him. The last hours. When Krishna knew his hour had come, forbidding his disciples to follow him, he repaired to the bank of the river Ganges, and having performed 3 ablutions, he knelt down, and looking up to heaven, he prayed to Brahma. While nailed to the cross, the tree on which he was suspended became suddenly covered with great red flowers, which diffused their fragrance all around, and it is said he often appeared to his disciples after his death in all his divine majesty. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there. And I believe we will be able to finish this chapter tomorrow. Um, finally, and move on to the next. But the next section is called the Second Advent of Krishna. So this is more going to be more about the story of Krishna and basically how it's more or less identical to the story of Jesus, but occurred 1200 years before. Um, in my opinion, showing that the Romans utilized the story of Krishna in creating the Gospels. But Krishna was not the only source that they used. They used, uh, many sources, but it seems like Krishna was one of the most prominent. So we'll get into that tomorrow. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and contribute. And come back tomorrow to learn more about Krishna, Christ, and Kersey Graves' 16 crucified saviors before Christianity on the newest Bible Decode episode. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.